Yo YouTube, how's it going? 60 FPS Tech here, and I want to do a video today on helping you guys switch or dual boot, more specifically Windows and Linux. It's really important to have a Linux distro handy if you're going to do any kind of serious development, especially with open source software. That's basically the way the world works right now. So Mac is also an option, but as we know, their hardware is really expensive, and so that can kind of put it out of the reach of some people. What Linux is awesome for is we can repurpose our desktop or laptop that we already have that's not from Apple, and we can start doing serious development on that right away. So we need to do a couple of things here specifically, and we're going to have to format a USB stick to have a bootable image of Linux on it. Now, the easiest one that I always like to get it started with is Ubuntu. So if we just go to download Ubuntu, this is pretty simple. We'll go to the download page and we will select long-term service or LTS. There's a newer version available, 17.10, but specifically long-term service releases for Ubuntu are usually the safer bet. So you can think of these greater versions that aren't long-term service as kind of in-between versions that they do between major LTS supported versions. So we'll just go down here, download. And here we can make a donation. I won't be making a donation today, but if you have the financial means, if you start using Linux a lot, come back later. Highly recommend donating to Canonical, the group that maintains Ubuntu. They do a lot of great work with that. So for now, we can just click here, take me to download, and we'll start downloading the ISO. And hopefully we're all used to by now, ISO files are basically just system images that are ready to be burned. They used to be burned onto disks. Now we burn them onto USB sticks to install. So I've actually already got this downloaded. You can see it right here. It's already finished, so we don't have to worry about finishing this download because it's going to take about 4 minutes. So no worries there. If you don't have it yet, finish that download. The next thing we need is Win32 Disk Imager. Now this is a really useful program if you're doing any kind of Windows, Linux, dual booting. You'll need to create a lot of system images to install Linux with. So Win32 Disk Imager is just the perfect little program for taking a Linux ISO and burning it onto a USB stick. So this install is really small. I've actually already got this installed as well and already got it running on my machine. So we'll just fire that up. If you don't, make sure you run the installer, and then you can run it right after that. So we'll do Win32 Disk Imager, and we'll put in our SD card into our computer. It helps if you have USB 3, USB 3.1, stuff like that. It will be a lot faster to write these image files. But I actually missed one small step here. You can see the computer is recognizing the drive. Sometimes when you use something like Win32 Disk Imager to write a system image to a USB stick, it can create multiple partitions on that USB stick, and then it actually becomes really difficult to use the rest of the storage on there. You can kind of get locked out. So you can see here that it's created 2 partitions. One of them is 4 megs, and this one is unreadable. So I actually have a Manjaro install file, another Linux distro, already formatted on this disk. And this is kind of a pain because you can't really, these are different drives already selected by Windows. So you actually need the full root USB stick when you write the image file. So you want to clear out these partitions that you've created previously, or maybe you formatted the drive previously for exFAT or using on a Mac or any other purpose. So there's a really handy program for doing that. It's called a diskpart, and we get there through the command prompt. I always like to run the command prompt as administrator. So you just hit start, CMD, and you can right click run as administrator. And once you get this prompt, just type diskpart, right? And this is a disk partition management software just purely on the command line that Windows has. So the commands here are going to be list disk, and you'll see that I have a 3.5-inch hard drive here, a 3.5-inch hard drive here, both 2 gigs, and then I have my main system drive here, which is 1 terabyte SSD. Now you have to actually know the disks in your system and know their capacities and know which one's which, because you can select the wrong one here and do something pretty bad. So we actually want disk 3 because I have a 128 gig SD card in there, and of course the formatted size is always less than the advertised size, so that's why you're seeing 115 here instead of 128. But anyway, the commands are pretty simple. We're going to select disk 3, right? And then we just type clean. Right, boom, we've cleaned the disk. Now, when we go back here, you can see that our extra partition died or went away, and we just have a raw, unformatted F USB stick drive ready to use. So now we have all the extra partitions moved. If we go back to Win32 Disk Imager, right, we can select the image file here from downloads. And the weird thing about this is Win32 Disk Imager hides ISO files by default. So you'll see this filter here by file type in the corner. Just make sure you click star.star. That'll show all files. Right, then we can pick Ubuntu, ISO, select, right, and then we want to click the F drive, right? That's our USB stick right here. And then we just want to click write, right? And we're going to hit yes. It's going to say it can corrupt the device because it's going to do a low-level format of the USB stick, create partitions, create the boot, the backup, the restore, all those miniature partitions that an OS maintains when it boots itself. So it's going to format all of that for us automatically. And you can see here USB 3 speeds are pretty awesome. It's going at almost 100 megabytes a second, about 15 seconds total required. Again, if you're using USB 2 or you have a slower USB key, that's going to take a lot longer. I always try to keep 2 really high quality USB 3 USB sticks on handy just for stuff like this. It's just when you install operating systems, the write and read speed of your USB stick is critical to how fast that installation process is going to be. So if you can, make the splurge for some really nice high-end 1 or 2 USB sticks and just keep those specifically for installing operating systems. Don't lose them. Don't hand them out to friends. Nothing like that. Definitely keep an eye on them. So the last thing we need to do is we actually need to create storage for this installation to exist on. So you see we've got 2. We don't want to install Linux on these drives. They have lots of space here, but they are slow. These are spinning disk drives. We want to utilize our SSD. But the issue is if you did it like most people, you didn't create storage room for Linux ahead of time. You just installed your SSD, then you reinstalled Windows, and you said, yes, use the whole drive for Windows, right? So now after the fact, we have to go and resize the disk partition and create room for Linux because they can't coexist on the same partition, but they can coexist on the same drive. So we have to create a new partition with space for that. So we'll go to disk management here. If you just search for disk management in the Windows start menu, you're going to come up with this create and format Windows disk drive utility. So you can see here's our USB stick, which we just formatted. You can see that it made 3 partitions on the USB stick by writing it. So it did a lot of magical formatting and partitioning of our USB stick. So that's good. But here's our main boot drive. You can see that it's got the label C, which is important. Windows is always usually installed on the C drive. And you can see that it's got the boot crashed up and primary partition flags on that partition. That's really important. That means this is your main resizable partition. You can see this 100 megabyte healthy EFI system partition. You do not want to touch that. And you do not want to touch the 500 meg recovery partition from Windows either. You want to use the main boot primary partition. You want to resize this. So we're going to right click and we're going to select shrink volume here. Now it's going to analyze the entire disk for files that can't be moved. Some of those are your hibernation file, your page file files. These are system level files that Windows uses to maintain the system, and they can't be moved. So you can't shrink beyond or past any unmovable Windows system files, right? So that's important to know. But what we can do is we can probably type in. So right now it's looking like it wants to shrink. I usually use a calculator for this. It's a little bit easier because it's asking in megabytes and we want to do gigabytes. So it's saying this value, which is in megabytes. So it wants to create a new partition by default of 470 gigs. That's quite large. We don't really need that much space for Linux. One of the cool things about it is it's actually rather small and doesn't take up a lot of space. If you have a smaller drive, I would say about 20 gigs is fine. If you have a really small SSD, you can get away with 10. If you have like a 500 gig, I'd probably do like 50, 60 gigs. Since we have a full terabyte, what we're going to do is we're going to do 75 gigabytes in megabytes. And that's going to do a nice conversion for us here, right? 75,000. So we'll take this value and we actually want to reallocate here. So we're going to say shrink the disk 75 gigs to make room with a new partition for us to install Linux on, right? So we'll click shrink here, and this will resize our drive now. You can see we've got 73 gigs of unallocated space. We could uselessly make a new simple volume and format this NTFS and put Windows on here. We'd basically be running two partitions from the same disk, which is almost entirely useless from a Windows perspective. But more importantly now, when we run the Linux installer, we can select this unallocated partition on our C drive to install Linux onto, and it's totally safe, right? This partition exists completely externally from Windows 10, right? So we can put whatever files we want here, it won't break anything, and that is going to give us that partition that we need to install Linux on, right? All by itself. So that's pretty much it for this first video. Again, we've covered, clearing a USB stick if it had a prior format on it, downloading the Linux image, how to write the image to the USB stick, and then how to clear up some space on your disk to install Linux on it in case you didn't have a partition ready for it beforehand. Like if you were most people, you just installed Windows on the full disk and hit go. So great. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you guys watching this video. And we got a lot more programming / Linux videos coming soon. Basically a lot of information that I want to share with you guys that I've learned over the years, both through my extensive use of Windows and Linux and my computer science background. Great. And we'll see you on the next one. Peace.